Hello and welcome to this episode on the configuration provider. Now that's not a pattern in the true sense. I've never seen anyone call it a pattern. And you might think, what am I going to learn in this video? So I'm hoping you learn a few things, quite a few things that will be useful that you could use in your projects if you're not already doing this sort of thing. And even if you're doing something similar, I think some of the guidances and roles and responsibilities that I provide you here in this video will help you improve what you're already doing. At least that's the hope. So this episode is about providing an abstraction over your configuration access. So we have different ways to access configuration in .NET now because of .NET Framework and .NET Core being different. And there's a whole host of other issues that occur if you access the configuration system directly. And I see this happening a lot in large enterprises and small companies. It doesn't really matter. And I've learned over the years that you want to have an abstraction, but there are certain roles and responsibilities for this abstraction. Now in this video, we'll be talking, and I'll be showing you code related to the .NET Framework. I'll have another video, probably shorter, that shows you the code or talks about the code for the .NET Core framework. They're slightly different. Just one method is different. And then I'm also planning to have another video on unit testing of the configuration provider that I show you today. I think it's a good exercise for somebody who's starting out unit testing. If you're mocking and you're open to doing unit testing in a slightly different way, then that'll be a good exercise, good introduction to widening your horizons, if you will, on how else you can do unit testing. And thirdly, there are many important reasons to do unit testing of such a thing as a configuration provider, even though most people, and I've seen this happen in large production systems and teams, they think they don't have no need to test a class that is, let's say, talking to the file system. I think it's just so hard for them to test it that they don't want to test it. So there'll be a third video on this configuration provider, more from a unit testing exercise perspective. So if you're interested, you can wait for that as well. So as I said, today it's about the .NET Framework. So the roles and responsibilities of a configuration provider. One, it needs to abstract the source of the configuration. By that I mean, where is that config data coming from? Is it coming from a config file? Is it coming from a database? Is it coming from a service? Is it coming from just a regular file? Who cares, right? Your configuration provider is the class that your entire system will use, and the entire system doesn't want to know where exactly is the config file itself, right? So that's one clear role for the configuration provider. The second is strongly typed interface. What do I mean by that? Frequently, you'll store things in your config file that you know in your mind as a datetime, as a bool, or as an int, or whatever type, except you're storing it, of course, as a string. And the configuration provider should give you a strongly typed interface, which means the properties of methods in this class should surface those properties strongly typed. So if something is supposed to be an int in your system, then the configuration provider should be ensuring that it is an int and it can convert it to an int and return that to you. The third is what I call locking the backdoor. If you've not heard me saying this before, front door, back door. So there's an idea that I have. If you lock the front door and you lock the back door, you're safe in the house. I won't get into the details for that. You can watch this other video I have on programming with intent, where I discuss this idea. But for now, just see it from this perspective. The configuration provider is accessing some data source, file system, database, whatever. So data is coming into your system. Anytime data comes into your system, you want to make sure it's clean data before it really enters your system, right? So the configuration provider becomes that backdoor. So when it gets data from outside, its responsibility is to ensure this data is valid, cleaned, whatever you have to do to it, and only then send it through the rest of the system. If it's not, it needs to throw an exception. So that's the responsibility of the configuration provider. And Third, when you throw exceptions, they have other criteria. If you're throwing exceptions, which I do, and I throw a lot of exceptions, there are in my systems, there is a criteria for throwing exceptions. There are certain responsibilities, if you will. If you're throwing exceptions, you need to do the following. One, your exception messages should explain the problem very clearly and to the detail possible. Also including, for example, if you're saying, hey, I didn't like this value, then show them the value. Don't say, I didn't like the value you sent me. The value that they sent or that you received in an argument needs to be a part of the exception message. The exception message should also explain the problem as clearly as possible. And the exception message should also give you possible options or possible ways to resolve the problem. For example, I didn't like this value, but you need to pick one of these 3, 4, 5, 6 values, right? So if it's something like is a bool, then it should be, please send me like a true as a string and a false as a string. Or if it's a date time, you need to say that it's a valid date time. Maybe it's a range of date times from this date to that date. So all of that information should be a part of your exception message. Think of it this way. When your application has an exception in production, in many environments, you don't have access to the production systems themselves. You will see the log files, but that's about it. So imagine yourself looking at your log files and you see this exception. What information would you like to see such that you know exactly what the problem is by looking at the exception message? You shouldn't have to open your system, debug it, and trying to figure out how the hell this exception occurred. If somebody is using your system, let's say another team in the same organization is using your system, so your system is a service, do you want that team to have to contact you each time they see an exception, even though it's not a problem? Because the exception message is not clearly explaining to them what exactly went wrong and what exactly they can do to fix the problem, they have to contact you. So my perspective of throwing exceptions comes from that angle. I don't want to have to open up Visual Studio and start debugging my code because I see an exception in a log file because I'm trying to reproduce the problem. I see the input data that caused the problem. I understand the reasoning for the exception very clearly, and I'm given possible options. So from a configuration provider's perspective, its responsibility becomes to throw an exception. It's also aware of which configuration settings are required and optional, right? And we'll see that in the code in a minute once we switch over to that. So I'll reiterate the roles and responsibilities as we go through the code, and let's take a look at the code. So this project here is a very, very simple project. It's not very complicated. It's just got the two classes, the base class, and my naming convention is, as you can see, is kind of, for some people might be going backwards. There's configuration provider base and this configuration provider. You could have configuration provider local, configuration provider Azure, configuration provider database as descendants of configuration provider base. So my naming convention is the change occurs at the tail end so that these classes all appear together in your Solution Explorer. And therefore you can say, okay, these are all the configuration provider, either the base class or descendants. Now, if there's only one expected in your system, then the production version of that class is always called just configuration provider. There's no need to say production or whatever else, right? So in this case, the configuration provider configuration provider class, this guy here, is the production version, while configuration provider base is the base class. So I'm going to show, or let's look at the base class. So I've listed out, and I'll make this project available on my GitHub site. I've listed out the roles and responsibilities here, right? You can read that again. Essentially, this is the base class. It's an abstract base class. It's called this. And every method or every property here has been described as to the intention and purpose, so that when we use this project for unit testing purposes, also the requirements, if you will, the business requirements are already described in the class itself. So that way, as a tester, as a unit tester, you know the requirements and you can write tests for it to ensure that this class does exactly what it's supposed to be doing. So it says this template property is required, so it's not optional. And so there's a method that says get configuration setting value throw if not found, right? So it's going to get this value from the config file. Now remember this is in the base class. Now typically abstract base classes don't have any implementation, right? They're just providing that interface so that descendants can implement that interface and have their own implementation. But the way this base class has been implemented is such that it is still agnostic of the source of the data, whether it's coming from are you in a .NET framework application? Are you in a .NET Core application? Are you accessing your data, your config system data from a file or a config file or a JSON file or a database or a service? It doesn't matter. But it is baking in the requirements in the base class. So no matter what your implementations are, let's say for the .NET framework, for the .NET Core framework, using a database, using a service, whatever the case is, the requirements are baked into the base class. Therefore, you don't have to re-implement all of those requirements over and over again. All the descendant classes are doing is extracting that data, the key, if you will, from a config file system, given the key name. So they each know how to extract that data, but the base class is handling or baking in the rules, which properties are required, not required, or in some cases we have other things that the base class will do. So I'll show you over here. And I won't explain the code in too much depth because you can always look at the code on GitHub. So one, this property is required, and the two, it says that the property ensures that the email template path always starts with a backslash. So this is a file path, if you will. So the idea being that there's a base folder that your application is in, and then from that point forward, where should the templates be stored, if you will. So the assumption is that all paths, file paths, will start with a backslash so that you can tack on the base path plus this path, right? So you know everywhere in your system, you can just make that assumption that if I get a path from the config provider, you'll always have that the starting with a backslash, and that's the responsibility of the provider, and it's baked into the base class. So the descendants don't have to worry about this. So you can see that happening over here, and it's a string. The next property is also a string. It's a payment gateway service URL, and as you can see in the sort of the requirements here, it's saying it's using this get configuration setting value throw if not found. And in this case, for URLs, I have this other rule in my config systems. All URLs should end with a /. Again, typically because you're always storing sort of the base URI of a service endpoint. And then you tack on the endpoints within your application for the different endpoints. So now you may miss the setting in the config file itself as a trailing /, but the configuration provider, in this case the base class, will take care of that as well. So it's not going to complain. It's going to complain when the property is not there, but it's not going to complain if it's not ending with a /. So the little things it'll do for itself, for you anyways. But again, all of this is agnostic of the source of the configuration, as in, is it coming from a app.config, web.config, or is it coming from app-settings.json, or is it coming from a database? The next property is the date time. And there's a bunch of rules here essentially saying that the year is relevant, in this case just the month, and the day is relevant. So you can have any year in the system, but when this property returns, the year will always be 0001. And it does got a bunch of things here. So in this case, the year is fiscal year start is optional. If it's optional, it just default to 10/01. So October 1st, 0001. But otherwise, it has to validate the date that is in the config file and make sure it's sort of a date of an actual date and stuff like that, and do all of that implementation here. And including this ensure ensure configured fiscal year start is valid date, that implementation also is in the abstract base class, if you will. So therefore, all descendants don't have to sit and do the same kind of thing over and over. Now, what's interesting here is, as you can see, if the value from the config file is a null or white space, it simply returns this date as per the requirements. But if it's not, then it tries to parse that into an actual date. And then if it was not able to parse that, then of course it throws an exception. But if it was able to parse it, then it returns that. And look at the exception messages here as well. It says the fiscal year start date configuration setting value of blah is not a valid date time. This property is expected to be a valid parsable date time. Now you know exactly what's happened. It's tried to access that property, fiscal year start date, from the configuration file. It found some value, which is maybe not a valid date time or can't be parsed to be a valid date time. And so it's telling you need to provide me with a valid date time. So that's very clear as to what the issue is, how to fix it. And the next property is the bool. Similar idea. In this case, it's optional. And it says here, if the setting is not a valid, if no config setting is found in production, there's no need for the setting. So basically, this property should return true by default. So the other idea I have, there are a few other ideas with config files I didn't mention. I want to keep my config files as small as possible. I don't like unnecessary stuff in my config files. The only things when systems go from, let's say, our dev machine to the dev environment to, let's say, a staging environment, before they go to production, there's different environments you might go into. Stuff that changes from environment to environment belongs in the config file. I've never had a situation where I can just tweak the config file and push it into production directly. Now maybe some people have that option or do that. I don't ever do that. A change in configuration is not a simple matter of changing the configuration file and just sending it straight into production. Any change that we do in our production environments have to be tested and go through the same sort of environments over and over, and the code as well. So trying to use something in the config file to say, well, I can quickly make a change in production and things are going to start working. I'm not sure I would go down that route. If you can do that, great, but I don't know if you've tested that other option, right? I mean, you know that this part has been tested in production, but what about if you turn it off or whatever the case may be? So that's a little dicey. The other thing I have is I don't have anything in my configuration file that is kind of like a debug versus not debug kind of thing. That's very dangerous. I've had situations where, not just my systems, but other teams, where a couple of months have gone by in production and they realized that no data was being saved. Can you imagine? Because they had these switches, what they call feature switches, that nobody knew whether it should be turned on or off or what it meant. And that's the other problem with naming, right? If you don't name things correctly, your key, the key of the setting has to be such that by looking at the key itself, no code, no background information about the system, or I'm not a dev on the team, I want to look at that key in the configuration file and I should have a really decent idea as to what that key might imply. So when you name the keys in your config system, they should be very descriptive. By descriptive, I don't mean wordy, but you need to pick a name that very clearly indicates what they're doing, right? So things that change from environment to environment, let's say a database connection string. So our environments are like in silos, so you can't go from one environment and talk to a database in another environment. So your database is in this environment and your setting or the connection for that database is a certain setting. When you go to the next environment, it changes. When you're talking to, let's say, 3 other dependent services that are internal to the organization in environment 1, let's say staging, the URLs are something. When they go to production, the URLs are different. So then those settings should be in your config file. But I stay very, very far away from feature switches and this and that. I realize that there are needs for them. And if there are needs for them, then the defaults should mean that you don't need to have the config setting in production, if that makes sense. So for example, here in the notify on upload, the default, production default is true, which means if there's no setting found, as in the key itself is the entire sort of that XML node is not there in the config file, it'll assume true. That means you could start making your production config files smaller and smaller, if you will, lesser settings and lesser to go wrong. That is my aim. Config profiles have been a bane of many, many teams' problems. I've had issues many, many years ago with the same thing. And over the years, I've just become averse to having too many things in the config file and not having enough controls, if you will, around the config systems, which is the genesis of this video. All right, moving on to the next thing here, the email value that comes from the notify upload. Oh, there's another thing I would like to show you here. The property name is called notify on upload. The key name is also called notify on upload. If this were a method, it would be called get notify on upload. And these are very, very simple things. People don't think much of them, but I'm telling you what, this is a huge benefit from a maintenance standpoint, and from, like, I mean, let's say you're in production, you're looking at some setting in the config file that says A, and you don't know what A actually means because it doesn't map to something in your system, right? What's the point of that? If I see something called notify on upload in my config file, then I say, oh yeah, notify on upload. I have we use it in our system, exactly the same word. Therefore, there's no confusion as to what's in the config file and what am I seeing in an exception message, because I'm familiar with notify on upload in my system and the code as well. So that's very important. Consistency of names should flow through. Now, if for whatever reason you feel like in one place you're changing the name, you've probably got the wrong name elsewhere. So just look at that and change the names. Don't shy away from changing names, especially if it's improving names, and stick to a name that everybody on the team uses and understands. Don't have some shortcut name that they're trying to be cute or smart or whatever the case is. So the names have to flow through. Method names, property names, key names in the config file, or a database column name, whatever it is, they all should match. There should be no reason to start changing them as you're kind of going deeper into your system, into the code. That's one of the other criteria or roles and responsibilities of the config provider. All right, so it gets this, and it's not a required field. I can tell by looking at this. It's not saying throw if not found, but it's ensuring that notify on upload is a valid bool, and so it does what it has to do here to ensure it's valid bool. And again, it'll throw an exception, and the message says the notify on upload, and again, this has to match everything else. The name should never change. So the notify on upload configuration setting value of blah is not a valid bool. This property is expected to be parsable to a boolean value. Possible values are true and false. Very simple. Even if there's an analyst on the team that's looking at that exception message and he or she's trying to do the triage, this anyone could tell you. I mean, he could go up to a dev and say, I got this exception message saying it should be true and false, and it's also saying what is the value. Maybe there's a typo, maybe it's just T, maybe it's a 1 or a 0, whatever the case may be. Or 1 or 0 actually will parse. But you get my point. Someone who doesn't know the system could literally just repeat the exception message to you, and you know exactly what the problem is instantly, and you know how to fix it. And that's the purpose of the configuration provider's exception messages. Exception messages entirely, all over. Exception messages in my entire system follow exactly the same guidelines. I love throwing exceptions, but as I said, there's a responsibility that comes with throwing exceptions. If you're throwing exceptions, you can't be mean, you can't be cute, you can't be short. Describe the problem and the possible solutions very, very clearly. That extra time you take in determining the language and all the information will go a long, long way in making your life simpler and the life of the people that use your library, use your system, whatever that is. All right. Okay. So, and then in the database case, there's a specific type that is being returned. It's just a custom type that I've built. It's an immutable type. All my, what I call DTOs here, if you can see them, they're all immutable. So, and it's got the connection string name. Essentially, it's got all the properties that you would extract from the connection string in a database as a DTO, and it's immutable, so nobody can change it. And so the configuration provider uses that DTO. It goes through a bunch of checks here, and eventually, if everything is correct, it returns that. So if you look at this method here, because this is abstract, so in this case, because you don't quite know exactly how you're gonna, there's no commonality here. You don't exactly know the implementation, if you will, in this case, to go any further. It's like in .NET Framework, it's connection string settings, and .NET Core is something else. So there's no way to actually validate. And at the time of extracting the data, it just does the validation, right? So now we look at the implementation. So if I look at the configuration provider, you can see it descends from the provider base. And let's look at the get configuration setting value throw if not null, right? So of course it calls the other method that simply gets the value. So they both use the same, one uses the other method. And once you have the value, it then ensures, in this case, ensure config setting is present, throw if not. And this is a higher order function. If you don't know, if you're not comfortable with higher order functions, please look at my other video that I posted recently called, I think it's called Delegates and Higher Order Functions. Check that out. Come back here. This is really another good example of higher order functions. So you can study this, and that way it'll explain itself to you. But the idea is that I get this configuration state, which is another enum I've defined here within the configuration provider, and the state can be is null, is white space, is empty, is present. So there's some other function, this function is determining the state of that thing. Is this string empty, null, white spaces, or is it present? Meaning none of the others, therefore is present. It's not null. And so in the three cases, is null, is white space, or is empty, you want to throw an exception. But if you remember, I mentioned you need to throw exceptions specifically for the three different scenarios. So it's very clear when you look at the exception message, oh my gosh, that setting is not there in the config file. You don't have to wonder if it's there or not there, or is the setting empty, or you follow what I'm saying? Everything has to be so crystal clear that you don't have to wonder. You can tell somebody on the phone call. Well, I mean, I've done this, okay? I was driving on a vacation, and I got a phone call, and so I was from work, and I was sort of on call, and so I picked up the phone. They said, "Blah blah, what's happening?" I said, "Yeah, it just means the setting is not there. Missing means that setting in the config file is not there. So we just need to put it in." I said, "Yes, you have to put in the setting. It's not there." So anyway, so it's very clear. I don't have to know what the problem is. If it's missing, in this case it says missing. So this is the app settings key so and so is missing in the configuration file. That means it's not there. It's not that the value is missing, the key is missing. Whereas in the case of white spaces, it implies, of course, the value is white spaces. So this is the value of the app setting key so and so in the configuration file is blank. Right? So these are all specifically picked out, if you will, the words missing, blank, or empty. I've used empty as well. The idea is to be consistent across the system and the team. So all exception messages and the system should use this language if that's what if the meanings are the same, right? Including in your testing. So for the case where it's not a good value, then this method is called, providing you with the configuration setting state, and then based on which of the scenarios it is, it throws an appropriate exception with an appropriate message. Now in this case, in the case of configuration exception, I use the same exception message, but typically in other scenarios, in other cases in my system, these could there most likely will be 3 completely different exception types, as in very customized exceptions for these different kinds of problems, but not for config settings itself, but for other parts of your system. So I hope this is making sense. Now you can always see the code and do it on your own pace. I'm just trying to explain some of the code here, hoping that'll help you, but not going into the details. I'm not trying to teach you the C# parts of this code, but more from the discussion design aspect of a configuration provider, the roles and responsibilities. And then this one gets the database connection information. It takes the connection string section. That could be null, which means you've forgotten there's no setting. The connection string section itself is missing. And so it says again is missing, and so on and so forth. So you can look at this code. You can, this project is implemented, as in the one class is implemented. As I said in the next video I post, it'll be for the .NET Core version. The base class will be the same, even though projects are different. I'll copy the base class from this project and into that project, and then I have an implementation for the .NET Core version of the configuration provider in that project. Identical classes. It's not like the base class has to change because you're moving from .NET framework to .NET Core. Because it's a different project, I'll just copy over the base class from here into that and make that a .NET Core project. And then in the third video, I'll have a bunch of unit tests for that project and post tests. They'll all be separate projects on my GitHub, with links in the description for each of those different projects, as each video will have a link to its own associated project, and including the unit test video as well. So that brings us to the end of the configuration provider pattern, design pattern, whatever you want to call it. And I hope that I've been clear in my explanation of the roles and responsibilities of this pattern, and hope that you've learned some new things in this video. And if you have, please give me a like, please subscribe, please hit the notify button. I appreciate everyone viewing these videos, and that keeps me inspired to make more videos. So thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.